Isn't it nice to have Jace back with Amelia? Welcome home. Good morning. So Memorial Day marks the unofficial beginning of summer. It is the time of year when we have and celebrate graduations, we have our first cookout, our picnics, but it's also a day that we remember. I went over the history, of course, of Memorial Day, and it began right after the Civil War. And it was actually called Decoration Day initially, because people would go and decorate the graves of the soldiers who had died during the Civil War. The only challenge with that is only the North would celebrate it, because the South wasn't happy that they lost the war, so they wouldn't celebrate Decoration Day. So after World War I, it became Memorial Day, and the idea behind it was that all soldiers who have lost their lives in war, no matter which war it may be, it would become a day of honoring them and remembering them. You may have noticed that sometimes on Memorial Day, there is a fundraiser for veterans with poppies, where you get your little flower that's a poppy. And the reason for that is in 1915, after World War I, there was a poem written by McCrea called Flanders Fields. And apparently on the graves of the soldiers, poppies would grow. And the poem goes something like this: in Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. And the last verse is actually kind of a call to arms. It becomes a poem almost of propaganda for war. Like, in other words, you know what, we're under the ground now, we can't fight, but you guys are going to have to. You're going to have to pick up the thing. But so poppies were associated then with soldiers and with graves and with remembering. Memorial Day sort of morphed into not just remembering soldiers, but then also remembering all dead. Whether it's your grandmother, your grandfather, your cousins. And I remember as a child on Memorial Day weekend, we always went out to the cemetery to visit my grandma. That's what we did. We brought flowers, and then we'd visit an aunt or an uncle or whoever happened to be there, and just, pay our respects. Now, it never has been as big or as festive as like the Day of the Dead, like in Mexico or New Mexico. It's a little more sedate than that. And then truthfully, over the last, 40 or 50 years, Memorial Day has kind of begun to morph again to where we've just kind of left it behind, the remembering part, and have thought more about, well, let's have a picnic or a party, or let's, hey, yay, let's celebrate. Summer's almost here. So when I combine all of these thoughts, it's like, okay, so what is this weekend? What is this day about? And I think what we do on this weekend is we remember all of those who have given their lives in battle. And we remember all of those who have been killed in war, regardless of what side they're on. So whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, or it doesn't matter, including civilians. So we honor, I think, on this day, not our soldiers, of course, and all people who have been killed in war, that we expand Memorial Day into that. And we also remember our loved ones who have made their transition. And it seems what is embedded and inherent in this day is the call to remember our ancestors. As we are remembering those who have left, what else are we doing but calling forth on our ancestors? And then, finally, I think we need to look at where we are headed and how we can leave a great legacy to our descendants. So I want to go back to war for a second. The truth is, we have kind of moved away from our awareness of war, unless we specifically have a relative who is serving right now. Who has someone who's serving in the war right now? Mary. So that's kind of an example of what we're in right now, because the current war is being fought by about 1% of the population. And they're coming home, and then they're turning around and serving again, and coming home and turning around and serving again. And some of them are doing 4 or 5, 7 rounds, and that's unheard of. It's unprecedented. That's never happened before. Usually when someone serves, they do their time and they're done, you know? And so we're asking an incredible, an amazing experience or sacrifice from these people who are serving, from these soldiers. Levi Newman wrote an article recently in March, and you know, it's not only those who are losing their lives and serving over and over again, but the cost of the war to these veterans. The truth is, the VA estimates that a veteran takes his or her life every 80 minutes. Now, I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to get my head around a number like that. About 6,500 suicides a year, which is 20% of all suicides in the U.S. So there's other casualties that are happening besides, you know, just what's happening when you're there. They have, the people who are serving have been referred to as the lost generation, that they're very similar to the soldiers of World War I. When the soldiers of World War I came home, they were extremely, the word was shell-shocked then, PTSD. In fact, my grandfather, my mother's father, served in World War I. And he was in a mental institution his whole life. And I remember when I was an adult, I finally thought to ask the question, you know, Mom, what happened to your dad anyway? And she said, oh, he was crazy. And I said, well, where is he? She said, he's been in a mental institution from the time I was born, more or less. And I saw him once, you know, like when I was like 8. And I'm like, but well, what happened to him? And she said, well, I don't know. She said he went to World War I and he came back and he was never the same. And it's like, well, to me that says he's sane, you know. You know, and it's interesting that I never even thought to ask the question, and neither did she. And so we're seeing, you know, some similar experiences that people are having. So we're bringing that into our consciousness and our awareness on this day, that war isn't, losing life is horrible, but it's also, you know, what's happening. So I think it's also important, again on this day, that we acknowledge everyone who has died, the civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan, Pakistan, and today in Syria, you know, there were a number of children who were killed. And it's important that we focus and we remember them. So that's what Memorial Day is about, I think. We begin to remember, we begin to reflect. And of course, we remember our loved ones who have made their transitions, whether they be our parents or our grandparents, our siblings, our kids, and we remember them as well. So, in order to do something with this and to bless this, I've put a responsive reading in your bulletin, and Johnny's going to come up here. And I'd like you, before we begin this, to think about who you're going to dedicate this to, and maybe it's more than one person. Is it someone you know who has lost their lives in a war? Is it your grandparents? Is it a loved one, your mom, your dad? Hold that person or persons or people or country in your heart right now. At the rising of the sun and at its going down, we remember them.
At the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember them.
At the opening of the buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them.
At the shining of the sun and in the warmth of the summer, we remember them.
At the beginning of the year and at its end, we remember them.
As long as we live, they too will live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them.
When we are weary, and in need of strength, we remember them.
When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them.
When we have joys we crave to share, we remember them.
When we have achievements that are based on theirs, we remember them.
When we have decisions that are difficult to make, we remember them.
As long as we live, they too will live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them.
Thank you, Johnny. So we turn our attention then to our ancestors. And the truth is that other cultures are more in touch with their ancestors than we are because we're such a young country. I mean, we're lucky if we know who our great-grandparents are or, what country we came from. And we may know what country we came from, but then it's like, other than that, who knows? I remember my grandfather, when he was in his 80s, I waited a little too long to ask him about the family. And so I said, hey, Grandpa, so what part of Denmark did our family come from? And he would just look at me and go, gee, kid, I don't remember. And I'd go, well, when did the family move to Chicago? And he'd go, gee, kid, I don't remember. And, really, when I think about my heritage, all I got was yump and yiminy and skål, when we would have a toast. So we may not know who our ancestors are. We may not know who our great-great-grandparents are, especially if you're African American descent and brought here by slave owners. It's like, how do you find your ancestors? And yet the truth is, whether we know who our ancestors are or not, whether we know what town they came from or what country they came from, we share their DNA. Their blood runs through us. Their DNA runs through us. Their talents and their gifts, their quirks, the positive and the negative qualities are running through us, yes? Are they not? And I think it's important that we stop for a moment and just call in our ancestors. We can see the traits, like, for instance, with my niece. I mean, she was not raised near me, nor did I ever get to see her much when she was a child. And yet when I visited when she was about 20, her mom says, she's just like you. She's got your laugh, and she does all these things just like you. And yet you haven't even been around, and she hardly knows you. And it's that DNA, it's the blood, it's the biology that we are such a strong part of. So I want you for a minute to just stop and to reflect on your ancestors. So we begin with our parents. If you just close your eyes for a minute and imagine that your parents are standing behind you. And then behind your parents, their parents. And bring in the brothers and the sisters and the uncles and the aunts, and just imagine that they're holding you and standing behind you as we stand on their shoulders and as we honor them on this day. It is part of what has made you who you are, the gifts as well as the dysfunctions. So I invite you to bring your awareness back here. So I'd like for us to, this is the year of community and knowing each other's names. I want to take a moment for us to introduce ourselves to each other, just two people. All you have to do is introduce yourself to two people. But I want you to do it in a different way. I would like for you to say, hello, my name is Karen Lindvig, and I am the daughter of D. Lindvig and the granddaughter of Laverne Booth. And then perhaps with the next person, you might say, hi, I'm, and your name, and I am the daughter of, and then mention your father, and then your grandfather. And if you know your great-grandfather or great-grandmother's name, or even beyond that, then I invite you to try that as well. So it's a way of calling in our ancestors. So is that clear? You're going to introduce yourself, daughter or son of, and then mention your mom and your grandmother and great-grandmother, and then do it again, only this time do your father's lineage. So let's all stand up. Find one person, and then you're going to find another. Once you've done 2 people, then sit down. Once you've introduced yourself to 2 people, then sit down. Okay, have a seat. Finish up and have a seat. You keep finding more people. Okay, we're coming back together now. So just feel the ancestors in the room. Do you feel them? Can you feel that whole lineage behind you? I mean, how often do we stop and do we call upon their presence? Do we call upon them and stop and remember and say, hey, this is part of who I am? So in continuing with the process of ancestors, I invite you just to become still for a moment. I'm going to lead you through an ancestral prayer, and I'd like you to keep your hands, your palms up. Today I honor my ancestors who honored their ancestors, who healed the sick and strengthened the weary. I gaze at my own hands. I turn them palm up, and I see the healing energy being passed along from generation to generation, great-grandmother to mother to child, great-grandfather to grandfather to father to child. I honor this gift of healing that my ancestors have shared with me. I honor that I carry their spirit and their blood. I honor the bloodline that runs through my body. I honor the love that has been passed down generation to generation, that has surrounded my heart. I honor myself for embracing who I am. And if you would bring your hands to your heart and just sort of anchor that in. And then just releasing and letting it go. And bringing your attention gently back to this time and place. So it's important that we honor our elders, not only the ones that have made their transitions, but that are in our lives personally, but all. You know, we stand here in this ministry today because of Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. You know, we stand on their legacy. They had an idea. They had a passion for spirit, for God, and for prayer. And from that, a whole movement emerged. And so we stand on that. As we remember our ancestors, we recognize that not only were positive qualities, gifts, and talents handed down to us, but, you know, a few dysfunctions were probably handed down as well, right? And I was reading an article by Daniel Four, and he said, you know, even dysfunctional traits have a positive function. For instance, physical violence may be a distortion of past healthy warriorship. Addiction may be a way of numbing sensitivity that was required of ancestors who were healers and who were artists. The truth is that when we make the right choices in our life right now, I believe we elevate those ancestors in our spirit. So when you're healed, when you awakened to something, I believe that not only are we awakened for ourselves now and the planet and our descendants, but I think it goes back and that we heal those who have come before us. Daniel 4 recommends that there are a couple of things that we can do in order to heal our ancestors, and that is to dedicate good deeds to them. So for instance, if you're in a yoga class, sometimes the yoga teacher will say, I dedicate the positive energy of this yoga class to, and you can dedicate it to someone in need. But the truth is we could dedicate that to our grandparents or our parents. And so right now we can dedicate this church service, this worship service. I dedicate the positive energy of this service to, and imagine who you would dedicate it to. Let's do that silently. I dedicate the positive energy of this service to, speak their name. We're in Lindvig. And we let that go. Another gift that we can give our ancestors, another way of healing that energy, is that if your family suffered from sexual abuse or domestic violence, one thing that we could do is contribute money to a domestic violence organization in the perpetrator's name, as a way of reconnecting the energy and of reweaving that. And on the other side, if your mom loved flowers or animals, you can donate money to PETA. It's what we do at memorial services all the time when we say, in lieu of flowers, please give money to something that the deceased loved. But it energetically connects us with them. So the other part of this then is, what is the legacy that we will leave our descendants? I think that every time we heal a wound from our family, it heals us, our ancestors, and our descendants. And the best legacy that we can live is a life. The best legacy that we can leave is a life well lived. And that means expressing your talents. It means manifesting your dreams. It means taking those qualities that you've inherited and use them. So when I was a kid, we used to watch reruns of The Honeymooners. I was really little, and I remember thinking that the Honeymooners were real because Ralph Cramden was almost exactly like my father. Other than that, my dad had blonde hair, he had dark hair, but other than that, they were about the same size, and the way Ralph Cramden would yell and scream, and to the moon, Alice, and he'd do all this stuff, and I used to think, well, those are real people, and someday the cameras will be in our house, because I thought cameras took turns going to people's homes and filming them so that, you could see how other people lived, and of course we know that is the reality right now, isn't it, with the reality shows. You can watch how other people live on TV. But my father was very funny. He was very charismatic. He was very loud in some ways. He was very expressive and violent. He was very Ralph Cramden-ish. And it is actually a trait, I believe, that my brother and I inherited from him. And so what's interesting to me is he didn't encourage that gift in either one of us. He tried to actually silence it and keep it from coming forward in us. And yet I recognize that wherever he got it, wherever it goes back, that when I'm willing to give over, not to the violence, but give over to the other traits, that I'm honoring my ancestors. So whenever you are the gift of music or the gift of speaking or the gift of healing, whatever the gift is that is in your family, that is in your bloodline, when you come forward and stand in that, then you're healing our ancestors and we're creating a legacy for those who come after us. So what are those traits that you have? What are those gifts? What are those talents? And are you fully expressing them? And I don't mean by doing it right or doing it perfectly, but just practicing it. So today we do get ready for summer. it's a day of celebration, really, because the days are long and it's so gorgeous and it's so beautiful, and it's the call to be outside, to have picnics and barbecues and take trips. But it's also a day that we remember. We remember all of those who have given their lives for the country. We remember all who have been killed in war. We remember all who are no longer with us. We honor and we remember our ancestors. And the most important way to honor them is to fulfill our personal potential and life's purpose. This creates a great legacy for our descendants. This, I believe, is how wars end. I don't know that I have it in me or anybody has it single-handedly to go in and go, okay, we're going to solve all the world's problems. But we save them, or we solve them by solving and saving ourselves, by expressing the truest me, the truest you that we can be. So as we go forth this Memorial Day, we remember. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors and we celebrate that legacy by being who we are. And it is so.